Hey, people. I assume everyone's always ready for a weekend, so there's no reason to ask. Any questions? Anything? Story time? Anyone have anything? All right, how many people do we have? 20. All right, I don't know, we'll start-ish. Okay, same thing as always, just I'll put the chat box on and just let me know if you have questions. Either unmute and speak up or type something into the chat box, and I'll try to address whatever you have as we go. Okay, we're here, right, September 11th, and we have the 21st, was 10 days, and then we have an exam. I need to write that. That'll be this weekend, I guess. So sort of coming up, make sure you listen, either read the book, as we've been talking about, either read the book or just re-listen to the lectures, write some stuff down, try to learn. If you cram all the night before, it's going to be pretty tough to get to the exam and have an amount of recollection that will that you can sort of skip through the exam with a nice cadence and get the right answers. So again, if you want to do ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, if you want to participate, get some research on your CV, right, your resume, your CV, then let me know. Do well in this class and let me know. Let Nathaniel know, and we can start getting you some research. Again, just examples of previous research we've done. We collaborated with Treehouse. This was a drug rehab clinic where everyone was just doing like power cleans and squats and stuff. So they have substance use disorder, and then they go do a bunch of squats. And does that get them off of the drugs? And the answer is sort of yes, to a degree, like yoga and stuff. But it is helpful. And then this one is the study that we did here just locally, right, on campus at Pacific, using our own athletes, our own basketball players, and looking at the effect of Sparta on performance outcomes, on court performance outcomes, so how they do on Sparta, and then what that corresponds to on the court. So as you come up with your own question, which you'll have to do sort of soon, as you come up with your own question, it could really be about anything as long as there's data involved. It doesn't have to be about exercise. It doesn't have to be about sports. It doesn't have to be about health or medicine or physical therapy, anything like that. It can be just whatever, anything with numbers, right? It doesn't have to be epidemiology proper where you're talking about COVID, although you can do that. Data on COVID are abundant. Just go to Google and type in like the letter C and some sort of, probably California fire will come up now, but COVID or coronavirus or something like that's going to pop up in a hurry, and you can find all sorts of numbers. I mean, it might be interesting to look at what is the average BMI or some sort of health parameter, some variable that might correspond to health and the outcomes, mortality rate, something like that of COVID, because California, ridiculous number of COVID cases. The mortality rate isn't as bad compared to New York, right? Fewer total cases, really high mortality rate. And so, what maybe could explain some of these differences. And epidemiology, again, isn't about cause and effect. It's about looking for correlations and possible explanatory variables, compelling connections, weaving together a narrative with numbers, stuff like that. So no new readings. Just as we go through, there's fewer and fewer readings. So if you want to, don't feel you have to do these readings. They're very helpful. They talk about exactly what I'm talking about. These specific pages for each lecture are talking about exactly what we are discussing. They just say it in more sort of normal person words, right? There's no analogies, and it's just sort of written much more professionally than I talk. Just remember, when we get into epidemiology and the mathematics of population surveillance, stuff like this, population surveillance in general, if you're talking about a census, I mean, this is old. I mean, it's both testaments, and it's in I mean 2500 BC in Egypt. I mean, we have, this is an incredibly old undertaking. That's not what epidemiology is. That's not modern statistics. Political arithmetic, getting a lot closer. Remember the John Grant stuff? So we're in the 17th century, 1600s, mostly kind of second half of the 17th century. So know what political arithmetic is and sort of when it lived. So Hippocrates, remembering that endemic and epidemic, endemic within a population, epidemic visits a population, falls upon a population. So COVID would be an epidemic, something like malaria would be an endemic. No, John Grant and John Snow, those two. Know what, this is John Snow here, but know his narrative, this tale about miasma or miasma, and that's the transmission of illness or any other sort of condition by way of you smell it, and what people used to think. 1854, that cholera outbreak, what people used to think cholera was caused by and everything else was caused by, until John Snow came out and started running numbers and mathematically demonstrating that miasma is not, at least for most things. I mean, you could say there's like, noxious gases. I mean, you could have like poisonous gas that you're breathing. So miasma may be for like carbon monoxide poisoning, but not for cholera. And so it's important to figure out exposures and outcomes as some sort of surrogate for causes and effects. So remembering the odds ratio and the relative risk, that these two things, the case control is going to be the odds ratio. And I'll definitely ask these on tests. And then the cohort, the relative risk. And to calculate those, again, case control, odds ratio, it's just how to calculate it. I mean, it's right here on the slide. If you're going to do this for your own project, I'm not going to ask you to calculate it on any exams. Just be aware, if you're going to calculate it yourself for your project, you just have to know that case control, odds ratio, and then this slide, what those numbers mean. If the odds ratio is 2, if it's 4, if it's 6, increasing and increasing odds. And if the odds ratio is less than 1, then that exposure, if it is, I don't know, some sort of miasma exposure. Well, I was doing aromatherapy before I was exposed to the COVID, transmission vector, and I had a protective effect. It was a half as likely to get it. So the odds ratio of less than 1, that's a protective effect of whatever the exposure was. Odds ratio of 2, you're like doubling the risk of this thing. Odds ratio of 1 is nothing. For a cohort study, again, same thing. If you want to do cohort calculations, right? If you want to do relative risk, if you want to do these calculations for your project, then just what to do, right? It's on this table of how to calculate that, but you don't need to do this calculation anywhere on the exam. It's just knowing cohort, relative risk, the idea of what it is. Now, the nurses' health study, I mentioned this on Wednesday, and this is epidemiology after John Snow, right? Let's get into the 20th century is when the nurses' health study started, 1976, and it just keeps being renewed. It's still going. So know the name nurses' health study because it's one of the biggest studies ever done, ever, anywhere, and it's still ongoing. It's run out of Harvard, and they've just been doing it forever. And most of these claims that we get, if you do whatever behavior, you're at a higher risk of whatever illness or disease or outcome. The Nurses' Health Study has given us an enormous amount of these things. Population of over 200,000, just following people forward, right? It's a cohort study, follow them forward. Year after year after year after year after decade, let's follow them forward, 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 and associate exposures and outcomes, behaviors and outcomes. And that's where we get all this advice, right? All this nutritional advice. It's just epidemiology. And it's not often that good of epidemiology, but it's the best we have sometimes. And so fish oils, tons of people take fish oils, tons of people avoid trans fats, tons of people try to get in more fruits and vegetables. People, whether it's vitamin E or vitamin A, or take your vitamin C for this, and yoga is good for that. All of this advice. Now, yoga has some randomized controlled trials. But sort of preliminary advice on all this stuff, and certainly a lot of the dietary advice. How much meat do you eat? Stuff like that. Are you a vegetarian? Most of the studies and most of the advice comes from large epidemiological trial. This population surveillance, not tinkering, right? No modification, no manipulating of variables, no well-controlled anything. Just asking people, oh, how much meat do you eat? And then, did you get cancer? So that's sort of the level of. It's a little bit more sophisticated than that, a little bit more well-controlled than that, but not much. And so that's where we get all of this. Like, rewind the world a couple of generations, and on the cover of Time, we have everybody avoid cholesterol, stop eating eggs, bacon will kill you, your heart will stop pumping after your third egg. The advice was really against fats, right? Everybody lower the fat, be eating as little fat and just practically no saturated fat. And this really came from this guy named Ansel Keys. You don't need to write that down. You don't need to know his name. Ansel Keys. He had some really interesting research that I talk about in other classes, but the 7 countries study where he's looking at cholesterol and saturated fat and those sorts of behaviors. But then fast forward the world, and you start to get into research by guys like Steve Phinney, Jeff Volek, some of these big names in lower carb, more fat research. And it is compelling, and so that leads Time to sort of change their position. Now, Time, these aren't physiologists, right? They don't have PhDs in anything related to physiology or nutrition or endocrinology. I think there's nothing that they're studying. Just a bunch of journalists. But there's what it illustrates is these giant I don't know, paradigms, or these giant positions, these sort of tides of belief and behavior, where once upon a time cholesterol is going to kill you, and today eat butter, right? So how do we go from the first Time cover to the second? It's largely epidemiology. So what epidemiology does, this little graph right here, we have mortality, increased percentage, increased risk of mortality. And then on X, we have the particles in the air. So that's particularly relevant today when you go outside and you can barely even see, let alone breathe outside on the whole coast, and even inland a little bit. Go as far inland as Denver, and it's snowing. But quick question. Multivitamins, we will get there. We will get to multivitamins. That's what the question. There's a question asked about multivitamins, and many studies have said they promote long-term benefits. Other studies suggest there are a couple benefits. Yeah, no, I actually talk about multivitamins more in 147 in terms of I get into some of those labs where they test to see if the multivitamins actually have in them what they're claiming to. You look at the bottle, and the U.S. is especially bad for this stuff, and the DSHEA, Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act, or whatever it is, 1994, when they withdrew a lot of legislation on these supplements. You could sort of just say whatever and put an asterisk and say not evaluated by the FDA. And so supplements are a little bit sketchy, but I'll get into some of these. The question I'll answer it a little bit today with some specific supplements, not really multivitamins, but we can talk about that later. Um, but so you see this increased risk of mortality with more pollution. Okay, fine. But there's a lot to consider. And so, if air quality gets worse, sure, we have respiratory failure, we have a bunch of problems, but some other stuff to consider. I just made this one up, and not to be like, religiously insensitive or anything. It's actually a good example. So over here we have, percentage of the population, that's getting lung cancer, and we've divided it into 4 groups. Again, this is just made up. I just made this graph, but we have Mormon and non-Mormon populations. Now, urban, right? You're living downtown, it's polluted. Let's say this is like Detroit, or the entire state of California today. But let's say you're like downtown Detroit when weather is normal and it's just like pollution everywhere. You're in LA or something, the smog is everywhere. And so if you are an urban non-Mormon, right? You're an urban, you're living in the city, it's all polluted, and you're a non-Mormon, the percentage of lung cancer, let's say it's pretty high. Now, you're a rural non-Mormon, and you are living out in the farmlands. You are nowhere near the pollution, and it's like, man, this lung cancer is cut in half, right, between these two populations. And so it must be living in the city. And so that's what everyone would say from an epidemiological perspective, living in the city. And people say, oh, it's pollution, it's this, cause and effect. We see you move out of the city and the risk of lung cancer is cut in half. Well, not really, because we're not looking at people who moved out of the city. We're looking at people who are either in the city or out of the city. And so then let's look at Mormons. Again, I made this up, but it is a good example for a reason I'll explain in just a minute. And this is like living in the city, so you're urban Mormons and you're rural Mormons, and it's the same, right? Lung cancer is the same. And then you wonder, and this is sort of believable numbers, again, invented, but sort of believable. And you wonder, well, maybe it's not the city, because I don't think Mormonism is protecting lung cancer as a shield, right? It's not like, well, the air a Mormon breathes is different from the air a non-Mormon breathes. But traditionally, technically, sort of according to scripture, very few Mormons smoke. Very few Mormons smoke cigarettes, whether they live in the city or they live out in the country, right? Smoking rates are probably pretty consistent. And when you look at other populations, smoking rates within the city tend to be higher than smoking rates outside of the city. I'm not saying that's 100% everywhere you go, every single city and every single kind of urban and rural area, but you have to, for epidemiology, you start to notice weird patterns, stuff like this, where like, well, let's look at a particular race, a particular religion, and maybe there are cultural behaviors that go along with that group of people. Males do this, females do that. You look at different races, look at different, again, religions, different groups. There are, or different ages, older people and younger people. People behave differently. So the type of person who lives in the city might be more inclined to smoke, and that might be the lung cancer. It might have nothing to do with the pollution, right? And then so if you start looking at a particular religion who has a very low smoking percentage, right, behaviorally, culturally, religiously, that there tends to be a lower smoking percentage, you don't see this same relationship. And so that makes you question, maybe there's more to it, right? Maybe it's not just, oh, you live in the city and it's polluted, right? And so epidemiology, what you're supposed to do is be more inquisitive, mathematically test things, but don't just stick with the first blush of an outcome, the first correlation, and people stick with it and say, this is it, this is the cause, absolutely what's causing it, because that leads us into this embarrassing kind of retracting positions and um, sort of like everything you say is sort of being redacted and rescinded, and it's just sort of embarrassing, like backstepping, this backpedaling. You don't want to do that. You want to be cautious but you also want to declare what you're finding in a cautious way. um, and so but you can't do cigarette smoking studies where you randomize people, right, and say, all right, if your last name begins with the letters A through L, you are smoking 3 packs a day, right? If your last name is something else, you know, it begins at the end of the alphabet, then you cannot smoke anything, and you can't be exposed to second, third, fourth, or infinity hand smoke. And then let's see what happens. You can't run that experiment, right? You can't force people to smoke. So we use epidemiology. Now for cigarettes, it's obvious what happens, because as soon as people started looking at this, see these sort of 20-year gaps, this 20 years, people start smoking today, and then 20 years later, we see the incidence of lung cancer and other things too, heart disease too. But it takes a long time. You go smoke for a year, does that really change anything? No, not really. I mean, if you just go crazy with the cigarettes, maybe, but it takes a long time. And I would argue it takes the same amount of time for political anything. You know, the elections are coming up. We have Trump versus Biden. How long before there's an effect of this election? I don't know, 20 years from now or something. You could make a case that, you know, Catherine Harris was in Florida and sort of gave the election to George W. Um, and that was 20 years ago. That was the 2000 election. And then look at all the policies on the environment and look where we are today, right? It's not the policies on the environment. That's not like a 6-month effect, right? No one really accomplishes anything during their term, right? You know, fast forward the world 20 years and let's see what those policies amounted to. I'm not making a bunch of political statements. I'm just illustrating that epidemiology, sometimes there's a chronological, a temporal, a um, a time series where you sort of have to wait on things to see these relationships. And cigarettes is much better than politics because it's so obvious what happens in 20 years. And then people can start doing case control studies. Once there's an observation that's been noticed, you can do case control studies and say, all right, let's take a bunch of people who have lung cancer, a bunch of people who don't. Let's look backward and see what your exposures were. Oh, all the lung cancer cases smoked. And so you can do those case controls, or you can start doing cohorts. And those cohorts, those case controls, those are really where we get Surgeon General's warnings, stuff like that, because the Surgeon General isn't warning about randomized controlled trials, right? They're warning about epidemiological findings. But cigarettes and lung cancer is so huge of a relationship. It is just so enormous and obvious, and it's not certain, right? It's not even close to certain, but it's such a compelling, such a strong relationship that we're bound to find it. We're obviously going to find it at some point. It's just so huge. You sort of don't even need math to find it. You just sort of notice. You do like well, you know, my neighbors smoke and they all have lung cancer. I mean, you don't really need math at that point. It's that big. The math certainly helps. But to find less obvious associations, patterns that are a little bit more invisible without the lens of mathematics, epidemiological methods. These have to make an appearance now if you want to observe and demonstrate these things. So epidemiology is take a population, you know, people with lung cancer or D1 athletes or people with COVID, or a population is the entire group of everybody in a particular sub, you know, group, whatever. So the population could just be everybody in the world. You know, it could be 8 billion people. The population could be Pacific students. The population could be marathon runners at the Boston Marathon, something like if you're going to do some sort of, you know, thermal regulation study or whatever, you know, how many people get heat stroke or something like that. Whatever the population, it's sort of everybody. And in general, you sample from a population, but you observe them. Observe as many people as you can get. Observe them, whatever it is, their behaviors. Observe geography, observe everything you can about them. Just collect a bunch of data, and you start noticing patterns between these variables, right? A variable, anything you're collecting here that you can record and document and measure a variable, right? Measure a thing or document a thing. And you start noticing patterns, right? The number of people who have physically active jobs and Alzheimer's or something like that. Well, the physically active jobs, they're at a lower risk of all forms of dementia, something like that. You start noticing these patterns. You don't manipulate anything, right? You don't add or subtract physical activity. You don't add or subtract cigarettes. You don't add or subtract some illness or nutritional parameters or anything. You just notice, document, analyze, and then you sort of make these conjectures, right? You come up with some sort of cause and effect. And as I say in number 6, I say this, me doing epidemiology. I teach epidemiology. My research is largely, not entirely, but predominantly epidemiology. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, publish wrong stuff. Pretty much everyone does this. You publish wrong stuff, right? I'm not going to over celebrate my field just because I do it. I'm going to talk about my the faults and sort of of my field and my own sort of follies and foibles within, and everybody who's pursuing this, because we all learn from other people's mistakes and the limitations of a field. We can learn what to avoid. So epidemiology, I mean, that's a cute cartoon, whatever. I mean, most cartoons, very few are actually funny. The best you can do is sort of go, oh, that's cute. So, something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic, free range, and nobody lives past 30. This is not really true for the mean mortality rates. It's just about like, infant mortality. And once women can endure delivery and kids can live past 2, at that point the life expectancy goes way up, because it's just these means. But let's take this cartoon and put it into real statistics. 2013, The Lancet, one of the top journals in the world, top 10, I don't know where it falls, but one of the top medical journals in the world was looking at mummies, and they found that same thing. I mean, these ancient mummies, 4 different world populations, right? They're eating, there's no such thing as inorganic food. Well, sort of, I mean, organic, like, hydrocarbon bonds, but the idea, what we think of as inorganic, not organic chemistry definition, but like natural, that sort of organic. Foods. I mean, everything was as free range as it gets, plenty of exercise, and everyone was dying of like heart attacks. There's the atherosclerotic development was enormous even back then. So these risk factors that we've identified today is like, oh, you have to get exercise, and oh, yeah, your diet has to look like this, and oh, you can't smoke, and you can't do this, and you have to do that. Yeah, these ancient populations were fine on all of those, and they were still getting atherosclerosis. So there's more to the story than we know, and that's an important lesson when you're doing your own research. You're not going to have the whole picture. But we have been studying heart disease, vascular, atherosclerosis, and any sort of infarction, whether it's a stroke or heart attack or whatever. And we've been studying this for as long as we've been studying anything, and our answers are horrible, right? We're missing so many things. Just remember that Donald Rumsfeld, going back to the George W. administration, like 2000 administration, Donald Rumsfeld, those unknown unknowns, right? The idea of there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Most of the world is unknown unknowns, and so we can't get too cocky about our findings of anything. And traditionally, the problem with epidemiology is people are too bold, people get cocky, people are too precious with their findings, and the findings are usually wrong. It leads us in a direction, and I would argue every publication is helpful for some, as long as it's not like made up stats. The original studies that looked at, like Andrew Wakefield, looked that guy up. And so those autism associations with the vaccines, I mean, that guy went to prison for just like making up data. And so that's harmful, right? If you just make stuff up and publish it and pretend you're telling the truth, when you're just inventing numbers and just if you're lying, right, that's bad. But if you are doing honest studies, honest experiments, you're going to be wrong half the time, at least, right? Most of the time, you're going to encounter limitations because of unknown unknowns. The important part, I think, all of those, again, with like the Wakefields aside, who are just lying, I think the honest publications where people take actual data and analyze it honestly and are wrong, I think that's valuable because it gives people information. It allows people to think. It allows people um, to have apply an idea so that they didn't have to their own experiments, stuff like this. But we can't be bold with our findings. You can't say, well, this is the reason because I found it once. Like, okay, you're probably wrong. There's probably more to it. And this is a really good study that sort of talks about that limitation, where with epidemiology, traditionally going to the John Snow days, he's talking about populations. When if you're looking at cholera, John Snow is saying, okay, the population-based outcome is this. He doesn't talk about the individual. And so modern epidemiology is, we talked about a mixed blessing, and that's sort of how I would characterize it, where it's wonderful to have all of these outcomes, but it gets dangerous when you start talking about the individual. With smoking, we all know somebody who smoked until they were 103, never got cancer, the heart was fine, they died of like, some like skiing accident. Right, I was on the slopes. I was on a black diamond at 102, and that's how I died of a head injury. But I was smoking on the way down. We all know somebody, maybe not that extreme, but we all know that. I have some of those in my family. I had a great grandma who's 1,000 years old, and it's like no problems. And her mouth was never breathed regular air. It's just every inhalation was coming from a little tube of nicotine, and never had a problem. That doesn't mean, so that's at the level of the individual. She's one person, fine, right? But we have like the entire rest of the population to consider. So epidemiology analyzes populations to describe populations. It doesn't analyze populations to describe individuals. And so we have to just be cautious in how boldly we make that leap. And there's so many of those, Donald Rumsfeld. You don't need to know Donald Rumsfeld's name, but I mean, he's just this horrible, but smart politician. But those unknown unknowns, right? Are there cultural things? Are there social things, right? That's what I was trying to get at with my Mormon versus non-Mormon, as like, okay, maybe it's about smoking, smoking and alcohol and some sort of, illicit substance behaviors. And so we can get into some cultural, in this case, it was, religious, but religious culture, let's lump those in together. But there could be political variables, all of these, what are sort of unknown unknowns that we have to consider in tempering our boldness. And so traditional versus modern approaches, we've sort of lost that. Let's talk about populations. Now it's, let's make recipes, let's make prescriptions for the individual. And that's a little bit wrong. That you're gonna miss a lot of the time. And so again, this article is just talking about the shift in the level of analysis from the population to the individual. We have to be careful. And so going back to Angelina Jolie, we talked about her early this semester, where she got prophylactic double mastectomy. At least that was the news that I saw and remember. If the story is somehow different, let's just say that it was a prophylactic double mastectomy. And because she gets her gene sequencing of BRCA genes, right? Breast cancer genes, which is, I would argue, a bad name because genes do more than give you cancer. And it was this unfavorable alleles that she had, and increases the likelihood of breast cancer. And so but this is at the level of the population, right? You don't tinker with this, oh, let me give you an allele. Like that doesn't happen, right? So this is population based. It has to be. It's the only way to analyze this is epidemiology. And you can't randomize people to what their gene alleles are. You can't do that. So epidemiology is the only way to do this experiment. And whether you follow people forward or look backward, fine, epidemiology, but you're talking about populations. You're not talking about the individual. Angelina Jolie could have lived to 300 and never gotten breast cancer, just like my great grandma. Just never, didn't die of cigarette toxicity, although her inhalations had more nicotine than oxygen, and so that's the level of individual. So she still made a choice based on population-based statistics, and probably it was the right one. I don't know, whatever. Her oncologist is smarter with that information than I am, and she's entitled to make her own decision. But the idea of what the statistics say, they weren't describing Angelina Jolie. They're describing populations. And so if you look around the world, breast cancer is a fascinating one. This is a really good article. Don't write down my statistics about, the number of generations and what the percentage is, whatever. If I talk, this is just, every article says something a little bit different, but this is a really good one talking about all Asian women for the most part. But in Asia, right? If you're in Japan, if you're in China, if you're Korean, if you're in Asia, and you never emigrated, right? You didn't come to the U.S. The risk of breast cancer tends to be much lower than American women who have born and sort of raised in the heartland or whatever. But if those women, if sort of ancestors moved to the U.S., now we see leveling off breast cancer risks. Just fast forward a couple generations, produce a couple rounds of offspring in the US, and breast cancer risk doesn't really differ anymore. Now it's just like normal. Everyone else, whoever's next door to you has a similar risk. Sort of, race, ethnicity, these don't matter as much once you've been in America for a while. So clearly there's more to it. Now it's slightly more complex geographically than how I've just illustrated it. Feel free to read the articles if you want. That's not the only one. But that phenomenon is true. Move to the U.S., rear a brood of offspring, and you start seeing future generations not having a difference in risk. So there are other variables involved. What are those variables, right? If it's not just what genes you have, is it diet? Right? Is it behavior, lifestyle? Is it exercise or a lack of exercise? Is it how much time you spend next to power plants or something? Is it how angry the drivers are and you have stress responses that are super high? Is it miasma, right? So you're breathing weird stuff in the US. Nobody knows, right? But there are a lot of epidemiological studies that are trying to figure it out, that are trying to figure out what is causing breast cancer to be elevated in these particular populations. And so we're looking for risk factors. Again, you don't have to know anything about breast cancer for this class, but the concept of what epidemiology is doing, you're looking for risk factors, exposures, and outcomes. So it's an interesting study from the late 90s. Saying the odds ratio, right? We're case control here for odds ratios. You're looking at the odds ratio for breast cancer among postmenopausal women. So we have ex-smokers or current smokers. If you ever have smoked, you have an increased risk of breast cancer, and you get a pretty high odds ratio. Big increase in the odds of having breast cancer. If you take hot baths, you have a lower risk of breast cancer. A bunch of physical activity, you're lowering the risk of breast cancer, so go exercise. Shorter women have a lower risk. Women had an increased risk of breast cancer relative to shorter ones. Yeah, so tall. If you're tall, you have an elevated risk. So what people would take away from this at the level of the individual is okay, don't smoke and just become short and take baths, and I won't get breast cancer. That would be the individual, right? This is talking about whole populations. Now think about the type of person who's taking baths. If you're taking baths, you're probably less stressed in life, right? You have leisure time. You probably you're making time for yourself. You have more money to do. You have better health insurance. I mean, there's so many variables that taking a bath is soaking up all of that variance of tons of variables. The bath isn't warding off breast cancer. is my strong hunch, right? Oh, I just need to take a bath and I won't have breast cancer. No, no, no. The type of person who's taking a bath is less likely to get breast cancer. So what does that person do? What does that person live like? What neighborhoods do they live in? What sort of, are they doing yoga too? What's their hydration like? The type of person who's taking a bath, they're drinking plenty of fluids, and like the type of person is often the story, not that they're taking a bath. Right. So we have to keep that in mind. So getting back to the nurses' health study, this is that Walter Willett, that's his name. The Walter Willett guy. He's at Harvard. He started this. He sort of oversees a lot of these epidemiology studies. So the biggest, to a degree, the biggest researcher in the world. To a degree, depends on how you quantify these things. All the quantifications are stupid. Oh, there he is, right there, Walter Willett. So the nurses' health study is following men and women, but then this is Gary Taubes. He wrote this book, like Good Calories, Bad Calories, and a bunch of just a ton of these. Good Calories, Bad Calories is one of his that I've actually read. It's really good, but he's not a scientist. He's a journalist. He's a really good writer, and he's a thorough researcher, but he doesn't have a background in science. Great author though. But this is one of his articles where he said, why, when we're following the nurses' health study and all these Harvard epidemiology studies, how come they get it wrong? Not most times, but every time. Every time they publish something, you find out 5-10 years later that it was totally wrong. Like, why is that happening? And it's a good question to ask. And if we can go through the cautionary tales in research, just like I said, this is my field. I do epidemiology, but you have to note your limitations. You can't just go in pounding your chest and bellowing confidently and pretend you're right all the time. You have to go to a scientific conference. The smartest people are going to they walk this like serrated knife edge of material of their confidence. Like, well, I don't know this and I don't know that, but I'm pretty confident about this particular subject. We put up the armor, the defenses of like, maybe this is right, maybe it's wrong. Here's the information I have about it. The brightest, most successful researchers, that's what they do. They don't overstate things. Overstating is for people with 2-digit IQs on Facebook. Oh, this, right? Secret cure for cancer that your doctors don't want you to know about, or here's how to lose 50 pounds in 6 weeks, or that's for people who haven't hit the 3rd digit in IQ yet. Being bold like that is just declaring to the world that you're totally wrong and you have no idea. You're not smart enough to know you're wrong. The smarter you get, the more you understand that you have to kind of reinforce every sentence with a bunch of conditions and caveats. And so let's go through some of the cautionary tales of somebody give me times, as we're like 15, 10, 5 minutes to go. That'll help me, with my pacing. But so in 1966, and I'll tell you what to write down as we go, but just listen and I'll tell you what's important as we're going. And so far we're not at any important section. So in the 60s, this guy, Robert Wilson, right, he's this gynecologist. He publishes this book called Feminine Forever. So this guy publishes a book about women and menopause, considering it this illness, right? Menopause is not just this sort of natural consequence of aging you go through. It's an illness and it's treatable. Like all illnesses are treatable. It's a hormone replacement therapy. And so this started to become in the 60s, starting here really, this well prescribed, well taken, kind of vastly prescribed, vastly taken drug. 1972, we start marketing it, heavily marketing it. And so there's this marketing movie, this little video is developed, and these are quotations from it. The physical alterations that are associated with the menopause may induce emotional changes. When a woman develops hot flashes, sweats, wrinkles on her face, she is quite concerned that she is losing her youth. that she may indeed be losing her husband. Right? It's just so ludicrous. I mean, today they just sound funny. It sounds like a Saturday Night Live skit or something. But this was real in the 1970s, just trying to scare people into taking the medications. And then this isn't the lady in the video, the actual lady in the video. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube or something. She's like sitting in this plaid chair by a fireplace, and she's like, my boys are both gone and my husband is away a great deal with his work. The evenings bother me most, and I think we all give thought to the fact that our husbands might become interested in a younger woman, but I don't dwell on the subject. It's just so absurd. But so this is to try to market, right? So this is 1972. And when this happens, this is in the US, right? You see this increase in hormone replacement therapy in the US. In the UK, people just, they don't care about that shit, right? Yeah, who cares? Whatever, we're not taking it. In the US, people tend to be a little bit more, they are seemingly a little bit more susceptible to marketing. Marketing 30 minutes. All right, thank you. And so you see this in the 1970s, this little increase in hormone replacement therapy in the users, right? The number of people who are using this. And then it kind of tapers again. Marketing only goes so far. It sort of didn't go anywhere in the UK. And in the US, it only goes so far and it tapers. And then you see around 85, right, in the mid 80s, and there's this giant surge in the number of users. And you see that both in the US and the UK, right? It's just sort of worldwide, kind of first worldwide. Wherever anyone has access to these medications, mid 80s, it really takes off. And what happens there is science, right? It's the Nurses' Health Study. And so they start publishing this cohort study, right? They're following people forward, and they start publishing that women who are taking estrogen, and these women they're following forward, and they're just sort of making correlations, making associations. Let's follow all these women forward and say, oh, the ones who are taking estrogen, right? There's a third the number of heart attacks compared to the women who aren't taking estrogen. So the conclusion, the bold conclusion that sort of hits the media, hits the common folk, hits everybody, is that hormone replacement therapy has cardioprotective effects. You're not going to have your heart attacks and strokes and coronary artery disease and whatever. It's like, okay, there's coronary, coronary, like coronation, like a crown, like a corona, the logo is a crown, whatever, you crown the heart with those arteries, so the coronary arteries. So, coronary or cardiac, whatever, benefits protection. So people start taking it. 1991, there's a second study from the Nurses' Health Study. People on hormone replacement therapy have a 44% relative risk. So cohort relative risk is cohort study. We're following forward relative risk. 44% relative risk of coronary artery disease. And so we continue to just worldwide, first worldwide, we continue to just develop this increase in the percentage of women taking, of postmenopausal women taking hormone replacement therapy. And then you see late 90s. In the late 90s, it plateaus. And then, a few years later, it tanks. So something happens there. So something happens in the late 90s. And that's a study. That's a randomized controlled trial, right? Where you can get a little bit closer to cause and effect, a randomized controlled trial. And you see in this non-epidemiological study, the randomized controlled trial, so 2,700 women were randomized, and those taking the estrogen therapy had an increased risk of having a heart attack compared to those who weren't, those who were taking a placebo, right? So this is a placebo-controlled trial. So, okay, we have a bunch of women who are, menopause, and half of you are going to give a placebo to, half of you are going to give actual hormone replacement therapy to, and let's see what happens to your heart. And it was worse, the people taking hormone replacement therapy, as opposed, the placebo seemed to have like a cardioprotective mechanism. And so that plateaus because now it's 2-to-1, right? Well, we have two studies that say it's good, one study that says it's bad out of these big studies. And then 2001 comes around, and that's where we tank. That's where it just right tumbles off the precipice. And at this point, there's 15 million women who are renewing their prescriptions. And then the second randomized controlled trial comes out, 2002, whatever, this one comes out, and same finding where, against a placebo-controlled trial, they have no idea what they're taking, right? This is close to cause and effect. They have no idea what they're taking. Those who are taking the placebo have a lower risk of coronary events than those who are taking the actual hormone replacement therapy. And so hormone replacement therapy is considered this risk, this hazard, right, for postmenopausal women. And so it just falls, like the number of people taking it. I'm sure all of the drug companies were horrified and doing everything they could to belittle the findings of the randomized controlled trials. Now, there's a lot to explain what was going on. And I'm not saying hormone replacement therapy is going to kill you. It sort of depends when you start it. Today's research is looking at a bunch of different factors. Well, who is it? Who should this person be on it? When do we start it? Do we wait and then start, or do we start like right at your first ever warm flash? Do we get you start? When do we start this? What type of series do we do? And there's benefits, but you have to sort of dice it up a little bit. But what might explain the epidemiological findings? Who are the actual women, right? The people who are taking the drug, the people who are taking the hormone replacement therapy from the 70s, who are worried about their husbands leaving them or whatever. Oh, I don't dwell on the subject. Those women who are sort of fiction, but there's something close to reality of a particular population who's taking it sort of prophylactically and doing everything they can in their health. They're doing maybe Pilates wasn't around then, but they're doing, their yoga and their jogs, and they're doing aquatic exercise, and they're sitting in the jacuzzi, and they are sleep hygiene, right? They're trying to get their sleep, and they're putting on every cream to keep their skin, young and wrinkle free and not ashy or whatever. And so the type of person who is doing hormone replacement therapy in 1972 is very different from the type of person who isn't. And you can see those effects when they start doing the studies. The people who take care of themselves, they'll do anything to stay young and fit and healthy, and those people were the ones taking it. The people who didn't give a shit, right, they weren't taking it. And so if you take a group of people who care and are trying in every, they're controlling their diet and their hydration, and doing hormone replacement therapy and getting a physical every 4 months or whatever, and the doctors are sick of them, compared to the people who just don't give a shit, right? The people who don't give a shit, they're having heart attacks, right? Because they don't exercise, they don't do anything that would ward off a heart attack. And so that's where you see the epidemiological findings. You do all these additional behaviors, and the type of person who, remember that line, write that line down, because it's sort of the foundation of epidemiology, is the type of person who. It's a 5-word sentence that doesn't finish. A 5-word sentence fragment that really characterizes what epidemiology is, what it's describing, the fallacies. So if you can find a problem with epidemiology, it's because the type of person who is probably the error that you made that you didn't consider. And so when you get into fruits and vegetables and all these foods that people say are anti-carcinogenic, or on the opposite, carcinogenic foods, right? But fruits and vegetables, I mean, this article came out in 2011. It's been almost 30 years since we started talking about cancer rates attributed to, diet and stuff like that. But it is like almost 40 years now. And what do we know about fruits and vegetables and the risk of cancer? The problem is it's like epidemiological, right? It's the same thing as hormone replacement therapy. That's the state that we're at. That's the level of evidence we have for most, not all, but most nutritional studies. There's a ton of epidemiological findings sort of clouding our understanding. Not that they're not valuable. These studies are very valuable. They give us great ideas. They send us down a road, which may or may not lead us to the right answer. Epidemiology is wonderful. That's why I do it. But it's wrong most of the time. And you have to be able to fail and march ahead with confidence upon failures of your work. And so these what this study is saying, the results of observational studies could be partially explained by, that's from the actual study. That's a screenshot from the study, not the ellipsis, not the dot dot dot. But but then this is just me typing down here. But the errors in the measurements, right? If you're going to do physical activity measurement, that's the Paffenbarger questionnaire. And really smart guy who made that thing up. But it asks like, how many stairs do you climb in an average day? About how many city blocks do you walk in an average day? What exercises do you do? Do you play frisbee? Do you play basketball? That's the level of question that people are being asked for physical activity. You can look up the Paffenbarger questionnaire, you'll find it. But for diet, it's similar. Like, what types of foods do you eat? How much meat do you think you eat? Are you a vegetarian? I mean, it's just like simple questions like that. And people don't answer these things accurately because they don't know. They're wearing a Fitbit and say, well, how many city blocks did you walk? I don't know. How far is a city block? Well, it was like 12 in a mile. Okay, my Fitbit says I walked this many miles. It's not accurate like that. So in the future, we're going to have a little bit harder data, harder numbers, better analyses to work with. But historically, the evidence we have now isn't that hard of data. You're asking people, and people report things badly. The only thing you remember, there's this form called the timeline follow back, and it's for like drug use or like spousal abuse and big things that happen to you. And people can usually remember a big thing. When was the last time you fell off the wagon? You went tumbling off the wagon and got a concussion. And so people will, oh, it was this, it was on the 14th, I remember, because, but if you ask people, what'd you have for breakfast 3 days ago? Unless you eat the same thing every day, nobody has any idea. What did you have for a snack between breakfast and lunch on the third Saturday of February? Like, nobody has any idea, right? And so when you start asking people questions about exercise and diet, they have no idea, and they just list whatever the hell comes to mind. Like, yeah, I feel like the type of person who would do this. Oh, this would be nice. I think this probably describes me, and is usually way off. And so a lot of these nutritional studies are way off from the measurement side. But then again, the type of people who, and that's what we're going to get into. So vitamin E, starting with vitamin E, everyone loves their vitamin E. And when you get into these antioxidants, right, this is a fat soluble one. So it can get into like a phospholipid bilayer, so the vitamin E has advantages that vitamin C doesn't, water soluble, right? So there are biochemical properties of vitamin E that are wonderful. Sure, that is correct. But the health professionals follow-up study, you still see Walter Willett up here, but this isn't the nurses health study, but it's just another one. And we're just not following nurses, let's just follow a bunch of people. And the risk of coronary disease is 36% lower in people who are taking a bunch of vitamin E versus people who are taking a little bit. Now, usually comparison groups like this are either the top quintile or quartile, meaning the top 20 to 25%, compared to the bottom quartile or quintile, right? The bottom 20 to 25%, quintile is the bottom fifth. Quartile is obviously the bottom quarter. And so they look at these percentages, and like, man, people who are taking as a supplement vitamin E, and a bunch of it, have a lower risk of coronary artery disease. Vitamin E reduces your risk of heart disease. That's the claim. Nurses Health Study follows up. Again, we see Walter Willett over here. Again, I'm not like making fun of the guy. I mean, massive researcher, brilliant. We just have to be cautious, right? This is our cautionary tales section of people getting it wrong. So Nurses Health Study 1993, we find something similar. Let's look at the quintiles. So the top 20% of nurses with the highest vitamin E had a 34% lower risk of coronary artery disease than the lowest quintile. So 1993, vitamin E reduces heart disease. Wonderful. Let's all take it. By 1997, we all think it's wonderful. We're all taking it. 44% of cardiologists, MD, heart doctors are taking it. That's 1997. 2000, randomized controlled trial. Same thing as hormone replacement therapy. So they get a ton of people, right? So there's 2,500 women and about 7,000 men over the age of 55. They're at risk of cardiovascular events. And they compared people taking 400 IU of vitamin E to for 4.5 years, right, to a placebo group, to people, all right, so you take a ton of vitamin E, you take fake vitamin E, you take a little capsule of nothing, right, a capsule of like fake I got you. And the findings were no beneficial effect of vitamin E, but the relative risk, right? So relative risk, again, we're following people forward. And we see no significance, but the relative risk is actually higher. But if you look at strokes here, the relative risk is 1.17 with a p-value of 0.13. Now that's almost compelling. A cohort study following people forward, you see a p-value of 0.13. We'll talk about what p-values mean. That's approaching what would be called like a trend, maybe practical significance or a trending significance. It's not quite in that range, but these are worse odds. The risk is worse for people taking vitamin E. It's just not significant. It's not statistically meaningful, but the odds are worse, right? So we have epidemiology says one thing. It says vitamin E is wonderful, right? You know you'll never have a heart attack. Your heart will beat. Take your heart clean out of your chest, right? Indiana Jones, whatever that was, Last Crusade or whatever, whichever one that was. And take the heart out of the chest, and it's just going to beat for another 100 years, right? Your heart is going to be so good with vitamin E. And then you do a randomized controlled trial, and you find the opposite. Not quite the opposite, because you don't find this big detriment, but every measured variable, every outcome was worse, but not significantly worse. Significant, again, meaning statistically signifying, not as a magnitude. And beta carotene, right? This precursor for vitamin A. So people for a long time assumed this is cardiovascular mortality, right? Heart-related death, that is reducing the risk. This is cohort studies, epidemiology. Let's follow them forward. This one sort of says nothing. Remember earlier in the semester, a few lectures ago, and when I showed you that graph of confidence intervals, and it shows you this sort of mean and the standard deviation and sort of where we expect the range to fall. Where let's capture with 95% confidence, with 95% confidence interval, right? So you see down here, relative risk, 95% CI, 95% confidence interval. Definitely no confidence interval for the test because it paints a really good picture. So this would be your meta-analysis. This is after all of your analyses. Let's sum up the data together and do a new analysis, and we're seeing reduced risk of cardiovascular mortality. Okay, let's do trials. Let's do like randomized controlled trials, and we're seeing an increased risk of mortality for vitamin A. Right, so it's the exact opposite finding. Epidemiology finds one thing, randomized controlled trials say the opposite, and we keep seeing this over and over and over again. And so the important point, remember that 5-word sentence fragment, the type of people who. So if you watched Parks and Rec, Leslie Knope, the one who's super organized. She's like the most organized person in the world. She's like a psychopath with her organization. And that is the type of people who, right? The type of person who is like Leslie Knope with Nope or whatever her name is, with her organization, these people tend to fare better, right? So it's what's called the adherers effect. If you're very organized and you know, again, you're on the give a shit group, you're on that side of people, you're going to take the medication at the same time, you're never going to miss a dose. And so the adherers effect is an important variable, probably more important than medication itself in most cases, certainly in this case. So in the 1970s, there was this coronary drug project. Now, I'm not going to ask you about any of these specific studies of vitamin E, vitamin A. I might ask, what are a couple examples in which epidemiological studies, cohort or case control have found benefits to some particular thing, and then randomized controlled trials have come along later to say the opposite. What are a couple examples? And you could say stuff like vitamin E, vitamin A, hormone replacement therapy. You could say stuff like that. But you don't need to know the details of any of these specific studies. I'm painting a picture. This is the cautionary tales sort of narrative here of where statistics and epidemiology has come from, where it's headed, and what are some of the speed bumps along the way that you don't want to go over too fast and rip up your undercarriage on when you start doing your own experiments. Here's how to avoid making a fool of yourself. So the Coronary Drug Project, 1970s, looked at 5 different drugs, and do they reduce the rate of myocardial infarction, right, a heart attack in middle-aged men? So 8,500 middle-aged men looked at these 5 different drugs. 2/3 of the subjects were given one of the drugs at random, right? 1/3 of them were given a placebo. And so what they found, clofebrate, this drug that's supposed to lower cholesterol, sure, yeah, it managed to do that. It lowered cholesterol, but it didn't reduce the risk of heart attack. So yeah, your cholesterol went down, but the risk of a heart attack is the same. So maybe there's more to the picture. Let's ask the mummies if there's more to the picture, about cardiovascular disease and heart attacks and cardiac related mortality. Just ask the mummies. But yeah, so some drugs will reduce the cholesterol without reducing the risk of heart attacks. But the researchers were like, you know what, we're biased. We need to know. Let's analyze the adherers effect. Maybe people just weren't taking clofebrate enough. So the people who really took it, the people who adhered at least 80% of the time, that's a common threshold. People who take it 80% of the time. With like birth controls, like this isn't 100% effective. I mean, they're gonna say that on like a condom that's an inch thick. Well, this isn't 100% effective. Okay, because people didn't wear it or whatever, like birth control, people didn't take the pill or people, and so a lot of these medications, when they say, how effective they are, 10 minutes, thanks, how effective they are, it's because people don't actually do the drug or take it correctly or use it appropriately. And so this is when they were like, well, maybe people just weren't taking the drug. Let's look at people who adhered 80% of the time. That's considered successful. Now, Leslie Knope, she would be 100%. If there could be over 100%, she would be. Alas, 100% is as good as it gets. So that's what she would be. So that's what they wanted to look at. But the world isn't populated by Leslie Knopes, right? It's populated by people who are pretty good at remembering to take their pills. 80%, that's good. And below 80%. And so they found the adherers had a reduced risk of heart attacks. So the next step for a curious person, for a suspicious, a doubtful person, somebody who exercises their scrutiny, which is what all of you need to do in life, not just this class, not just in research, but in life, employ your scrutiny, is, well, let's look at the adherers of the placebos. And they found the same thing. Leslie Knopes, it's the type of the type of person who adheres and is structured and everything. You're doing other stuff too. You're warding off heart attacks by walking on a treadmill or Jane Fonda videos or whatever it is, people, P90X or whatever it is, the modern version of a Jane Fonda video. But people are warding off heart attacks with other things. It's not the drugs that are doing it. It's the type of people who. You see this same phenomenon with coffee, right? 1981, drinking 2 to 3 cups of coffee per day triples the risk of pancreatic cancer. Fast forward to the world 2001, coffee does not increase the risk of pancreatic cancer. Now, 1990, caffeine increases the risk of colon cancer. Okay, let's go to 1994. Caffeine decreases the risk of colon cancer. Now, coffee is another one, right? Coffee and caffeine as different entities, right? Methylxanthines versus a delicious morning breakfast. But all the coffee and tea and all of these things, like, so caffeinated coffee doesn't increase the risk of colon cancer at all, but drinking 2 or more cups of decaffeinated coffee reduces the risk of rectal cancer by 52%. People just, there's Walter Willett again, people just keep finding these associations and making bold conjectures, making bold claims. And especially with coffee and cancer, because we all love coffee, and whether it's bladder, it's kidney, it's colorectal, whatever it is. I mean, coffee does seem to get your feces on the march, right? It does seem to deploy it into the toilet in a hurry. And so maybe you could make an argument out of the time in transit of your fecal bulk, how quickly you can get that shit out of you, literally get it out of you. Okay, there's lots of explanations about coffee, but you see conflicted results on everything. So this one's on, let's look at tea. Tea and colorectal cancer in 12 countries, 30 publications, increased risk over here. Man, don't drink tea, colorectal cancer way up. Down here, drink as much tea as you can get in your mouth. just like don't even sip, just chug it, and you're going to reduce the risk of colon cancer. In the middle, who cares? Drink whatever you want, drink water, drink tea. You see these epidemiological studies are totally conflicted. Now move forward to what people talk about today, and it's more recently I keep hearing these reports about, oh, everyone should be a vegetarian, meat causes cancer, World Health Organization says. Now this is from 2015. Let's look at the study. Lancet, right? We've seen the Lancet before. Earlier this lecture, I said one of the top journals in the world, Lancet, and they found, again, this is epidemiology. This isn't a randomized controlled trial. This is just asking people questions, right? Colorectal cancer. Now, again, there's an explanation. The opposite of coffee. Eat a bunch of meat, and like maybe you don't shit today. Like maybe it's tomorrow, and you're on the toilet for like 45 minutes, and there's blood on the toilet paper afterward because it's just this dense ball of dehydrated like space food that's been compressed into like diamonds, right? Okay, well, maybe meat will do that to you. And then again, time in transit. There are some explanations for cancer, or you could say meat, all that excess protein you're getting, a bunch of protein kinase B, PI3K, PKB signaling, stuff like that. Okay, we could say cellular signaling cascades. There's mechanisms, just like there's mechanisms with coffee we can talk about, but that's not really what we're measuring. What we're measuring is epidemiology. 17% increase in risk for colorectal cancer for every 100 grams of red meat, 18% increase for every 50 grams of processed meat, those like bolognas and stuff. And then they looked at other cancers, prostate and stomach and pancreas and stuff. Now it's a much bigger risk than cigarettes, rather, have a much bigger risk than meat. This is a much smaller risk than cigarettes. But if you think about what they're doing, bad box, good box, the type of people who, you could fill this out without me talking, 5 minutes, thanks. You could do this on your own, right? Bad box. Well, the people, these are quintiles, quartiles and quintiles, what people are looking at. The top quintile, the top 20% of meat eaters, there's a ton of fast food in there, right? And there's very little fiber. There tends to be less water, less exercise. Good box, right? These are the people who are taking hormone replacement therapy in 1972, trying not to lose their husbands by hilarious marketing campaigns, right? If you're really controlling your diet, you're a vegetarian, you're exerting control over your diet. It's not the lack of essential nutrients that's healthy. What's healthy for you is this constellation of behaviors. You're doing more yoga, you're brushing your teeth more. All of these things that you're doing, more exercise. The people who are controlling their diet, eating the least meat, meat is delicious, to most people. And so the people who just, oh yeah, give me the McDonald's, they're those same people drink and smoke more too. And so saying, oh, it's the meat that causes it, when there's a lot of type of people who variables we'd have to consider. And so all of these things is implausible results from the use of invalid methods. Just the idea of we're not really capturing true data, and then the government is issuing these statements about eat the food pyramid and limit this and try to avoid that and include this. And it's epidemiology. We can't hold it to deer, right? So talking about proof here, so correlation, causation, we know that. We've talked about that stuff. Wikipedia, it's actually a nice little page here. Epidemiology is concerned with the incidence of disease in populations and does not address the question of the cause of an individual's disease. That's a nice little line. Again, causal stuff here. But the idea of proof, what role does epidemiology play in proving specific causation? So just remember the word proof. The word proof means test, right? This is test, to be a proofreader, a galley proof. You're doing a test reading. Probability, it's the Latin for test. That's where probability and proof both come from. Same root word, probably came to English in 1387. Mercenary and wallet, same year. The Etymologicons, wonderful book about the etymology of all these words. Probabilis, was overused. People use the word probabilis like they do proof today, where it's just this overused word, and the best days are behind. for the word proof. And so we get these things like the exception proves the rule, right? Well, if the exception provides evidence for the rule, that is gibberish. But everyone knows that expression, the exception proves the rule, because the exception tests the rule. It doesn't prove shit, right? It tests the rule. And so the exception overturns the rule. That's what sometimes testing can do. Or proving ground. That's where you go test your weapons, test your whatevers. The best weapon that the most ridiculous weapon I think that's ever been invented, the Krumlauf. It had, some of them had a 30-degree, some of them had like a 45-degree angle, and you could get like 150, maybe 300 rounds through those things, and then the bullets blow up and come out like shotguns, and the gun doesn't work anymore. But you have to put that through they're trying to like shoot around corners. And you have to put this through proving grounds, right? You have to test this thing before you go debut it. Proof, test. Don't think, just because epidemiology is sort of proving things, it's just testing them. It's providing some sort of concept, some idea, some direction, right? Some curiosity. It's nurturing curiosity. So do know Karl Popper. 1 minute, thanks. Last slide. Do know Karl Popper, Sir Dr. Karl Popper. The method of science is the method of bold conjectures and ingenious and severe attempts to refute them. So you come up with an idea, you test it, you're bold with that idea, you put, and then you test it, and you try to refute it. If you can't refute it, you're probably something close to right? If you can't refute the idea, there's mounting evidence that your idea is more sound than if you I've done this a lot of times. I've come up with an idea. I had one. Well, you feel free to leave. Class is over. We're just going to chat for a couple minutes. So if you feel like taking off, nothing I say at this point is going to be like tested or anything. But I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I came with this idea that cigarette smoking improved outcomes in thoracic trauma patients. And because I submitted a paper to this journal called Pain Medicine, and I guess I could figure out exactly when I did this. I think the journal came out in like 2016 or something. So that was, the era of when I did this. And one of the peer reviewers said, will you control for cigarette smoking? Cigarette smokers may die more readily. This is in this population, there's 7-point-something% of people who had rib fractures were dying. And so they said, see what happens when you control for cigarette smoking. So if you can isolate the effect of this particular treatment, I was looking at a treatment where they're doing, instead of just giving like IV morphine, which doesn't really do anything, just other than people feel cool and then they still in pain, it's not really an effective drug. I don't know how people get addicted to this. But thoracic epidural analgesia. You give them their analgesia in their epidural space. And I'm like, all right, fine, I'll control for cigarette smoking. And then the people who smoked cigarettes had a higher likelihood of surviving, right? It reduced mortality. Like, no way, this is just weird. This is a fluke. This is just some spurious finding. And I told the peer reviewer, like, you know what, I don't think this is real. It didn't, shed any additional light on thoracic epidural analgesia. I'm going to leave it out, and I might explore this separately. And I did explore it separately. And no matter how I crunched the numbers, Karl Popper, I tried to refute my finding that cigarette smoking lowered the risk of mortality. I couldn't do it. And so I exported more patients from this hospital, like another 1,000 patients or 800 more patients. And I repeated the study. Same thing, no matter how I looked at it, what variables I controlled for, cigarette smoking was good. And I wrote the paper, I sat on that paper for like 3 years. And because I was worried, I didn't want to, Jensen's, lobbying for cigarettes. I'm like, I don't want to be that guy. I'll get so much hate mail, and I'll take the checks right from Marlboro if they want to send me checks, but I didn't want to be that guy. And so I sat on it, and then finally someone else published it and found the exact same thing that I did. It just came out like a year ago or something. And so, but the idea of Karl Popper, you should try to refute your finding. If you can't refute it, it's probably right. And so I couldn't refute the basketball one. I analyzed that from 1,000 perspectives of Sparta doesn't show improvements in basketball performance. Improve all you want in Sparta, your basketball performance still sucks, or is still good. That doesn't change with Sparta. And I tried to refute that 1,000 times, knowing that the CEO was going to try to murder me. And he didn't try to murder me. I just got like hate mail from him. But A lot of it. But that idea, you should refute it. You shouldn't take the first blush of your statistics. You should try to find your loopholes before marching ahead confidently. All right, that's all the words I have in my mouth for today. Let me know if you have some questions. I'm hearing no questions. So is that us signing off?
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, bye everyone.